Welcome back, and we are listening to Dr. Van Zandt. This part of his presentation is going to talk about colostrum. So, podium is yours.
All right, thank you, Fred, and welcome back. We'll go through this presentation a little more quickly to try and keep everybody on time. But there's a lot of interest in colostrum now. I know the dairy goat industry, because of Cape Rhine arthritis, encephalitis, or CAE virus, has kind of shifted completely away from what I would consider more appropriate colostrum management for a farm. Again, I'm extrapolating my dairy background and what we've done in all the research with dairy. But I think we need to revisit this idea of colostrum and the importance of colostrum again in light of some of the comments I made in the previous talk based on the information that was presented in yesterday's program by some producers and the challenges of keeping these babies alive and some of the risks that we have in our losses. And to put a exclamation point on this, you know, here, this is data from what we call the NAMS, National Animal Health Monitoring Survey, one done in goats in 2015. We're looking at the percent kid crop death loss and the associated value of those kids lost. And this is what we call pre-weaning. So this is loss from the point of birth or live birth to weaning. And you can see Angora goats on average lost about 18.3% of their kids. Milk goats, dairy goats, 13.3%. Meat goats, an astounding 20.7%. I mean, that's a huge, you can see the financial loss there because you're losing your financial end product. And then you can see on average across all goat systems about 19.4%. Now, there are some predator losses, but non-predator losses account for more than 3/4 of these losses. To put this in some perspective, in the dairy industry, our heifer loss up to weaning runs about 8%. So more than less than half of what's going on in kids. Now, granted, we can't necessarily compare apples to apples there. But in the more recent, the 2009 NAMS study, again, pre-weaning kid loss, they didn't put it in according to the type of goat operation, but more just size of the operation. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think this was like less than 20 on the small and then medium and large. And you can see 18.6, so not a big change on our small dairies from what was reported earlier. The medium-sized dairies, that drops to 13.2, and in the large dairies, surprisingly, we're only at 9. And then overall, the average was 12. So obviously, we made some inroads. However, most of the inroads were made predominantly in our larger dairies. And so, you know, are such kid losses a sustainable farming system? And I would argue no. And that's why I think producers are considering extended lactations in terms of the dairy goat side, because it's not the kid necessarily. Generally, you would have more than enough replacements, but it's milk production. But in a meat goat situation, yes, kid losses are really severe. And so the question I want to try and answer, at least from the colostrum side, is what can we do to decrease these losses? Well, when I think about small ruminant nutrition and kids, to me, it starts with the feeding the pregnant animal. And to me, as a veterinarian, and my experience out in the field dealing with animal health, I think the pregnant animal on the farm, whether it be the pregnant beef cow, the pregnant dairy cow, the pregnant ewe, the pregnant doe, she is the single most important animal on that farm. And all the TLC should go into that animal. So when we think about trying to improve pre-weaning survival here in this group, we need to focus on the prepartum nutrition of the dam, and we're going to talk about some of this epigenetic impacts on fetal development. We already talked about the mineral accretion that occurs, and we're going to focus on the colostrum. And then I'm going to focus more on how do we define the colostrum and the impact that potentially has. So I'm Coach John Wooden from UCLA. He's a Hall of Fame basketball coach and player. He used to have all these very brief kind of witticisms that he would encourage his players to get ready for, whatever. And one of those witticisms I use quite a bit. And he used to say, failing to prepare for the game is preparing to fail in the game. And I think this saying is very apropos in my philosophy and my perspective on looking at animal health. If we fail to prepare that pregnant animal for lactation, we've basically prepared her to fail in lactation. There's no way you can feed her differently once she's in that lactation to make up for deficiencies in that postpartum period. Now, there's many different things I can talk about in this area. This is one of my favorite areas to talk about, but today, and for keeping this brief, I want to just talk about the colostrum side of things. Now let's start off with this interesting concept. This is a new area of research, well, fairly new. I mean, there's been work coming out since the 2000s. But what this is what it's saying is how we feed mom from the beginning of conception has an impact on fetal development and on the postnatal life of that animal. And that's really a change in the paradigm, a change in the dogma that we've had, because we've always just focused on the last month of gestation or 40 days of gestation in our sheep and goats, because that was when we had rapid fetal growth. But now we know that all the organs of the body are generated and established in the fetus within the first 42 to 60 days. And we now know that some of these trace elements, like selenium, when fed above the NRC requirements, actually promote greater fetal development and metabolic outcomes. Now we're focusing on colostrum. So when we talk about this epigenetic impact of nutrition, we can look at two different paradigms. We can look at overfeeding, being too generous in our nutrition, or underfeeding, being too skimpy or low in quality. And we compare that to what is the ideal. Now, there's a number of things that go on here that I can talk about in great detail, but what I wanted to focus on is when we overfeed animals, we can actually see reduced birth weights in our offspring, which increases their risk of dying. They have a shorter gestation, and the colostrum is only 63% of what they would have in the ideal scenario. And when we underfeed our animals, again, we get reduced birth weight, which increases the risk of death. We have a normal gestation period, but the colostrum is greatly compromised at only 50% of the volume. So if you have your goats that are producing twins and triplets, and you're only getting half the colostrum, this is obviously a challenge in trying to maintain a good colostrum management program. So why is late pregnancy nutrition so important? Well, this is the growth rate of a single. This is the growth rate of a twin or twins. And we can see basically that most of the fetal growth occurs this last 40 days or so, 40 to 50 days in sheep and goats. But the challenge here is not the fact that, you know, we shouldn't ignore this part up here, but when we get into this scenario, when colostrum is being formed in the last 10 days or so, this is when those animals have the lowest dry matter intake. If you think about those does that have triplets and quads, how big they are, you know, how much can they really eat and fit into their rumen. And so here is some work, some older work out of Scotland. This was in sheep where they fed 2 levels of energy in the prepartum diet, and then they fed 2 levels of crude protein within those energy values to maintain a similar protein to energy ratio amongst the 4 different diets. And then they measured how much colostrum was being produced. All right, and so you can see here in the first 3 hours after lambing, on the low energy, low protein diet, those ewes only produced 5 ounces of colostrum and 36 ounces after 24 hours. Compare that to the high energy, high protein, 22.6 ounces and 74 ounces. So tremendously different. And you can see there was a significant increase, linear increase across all the diets here. And so I think, you know, this isn't telling us anything about the quality of the colostrum in terms of IgG concentration, but this is telling us about the volume and how much colostrum we might be able to get into the offspring. So in the dairy side, the dairy cow side, we've always used this idea that feeding adequate amounts of high quality colostrum is the single best method of enhancing calf health. Now, this doesn't mean that colostrum is absolutely essential. We know from practical experiences and on-farm situations that some farms can get away with, you know, not doing a very good colostrum management because they do so many other things really well. But if you have any challenges in your environment, disease issues, then colostrum certainly is going to be the best single preventative. Now, as we said earlier, the dairy goat industry, because of their concern over CAE, they had moved to using cow colostrum and not using the dam's colostrum because of the transmission. And as a consequence, we brought things like yonis into our dairy goat herds. And, you know, the big question is, using cow colostrum, does this really protect our kids as well as it should? So I was really flabbergasted. I've done, as a collaborator with one of my colleagues at Penn State, whose area of expertise was calf colostrum and colostrum feeding. I was involved in a number of the projects that he did over the last 25 years or so. We worked together. And, you know, we have established quite a database as well as other researchers like Dr. Sandra Godin at Minnesota and others. But when I kind of shifted from dairy cows into sheep and goats, I was intrigued to look and see what was available and what we knew or didn't know about colostrum in these species. And I was absolutely flabbergasted how little we knew, because we just assumed in the goat industry, we just either in the meat goat industry allowed the kids to nurse mom, or we use colostrum replacers or some other substitute. And in the sheep industry, we just allowed the lambs to nurse off of mom. So there really wasn't this impetus to look at quality. And so the question now is, what do we really need to know? What's important that might help us to deal with this neonatal losses that we see? And so these are the big three questions that I had. What is considered an adequate colostrum IgG concentration in dairy cows? The minimum acceptable considered adequate is 50 milligrams per ml, but is that the same for goats? Now we assume it is, but is that really? And then the question is, can we really measure accurately the IgG concentration on farm? And then can we, we do need to get data that looks at IgG supply relative to survival and health outcomes of the kids. Another big question is, like we see in beef cows versus dairy cows, where dairy cows have a much lower IgG concentration versus beef, and it's a volume effect, are there breed differences between dairy goats and meat goats? And then finally, the colostrum quality is important, but ultimately it's what gets into the kid. And so the question is, what is the adequate serum IgG concentration in the kid? And then can we assess this in a simple way by measuring total protein like we do in cows or calves? What is the total IgG mass that's needed that should help guide us with colostrum replacers? And then does it matter in the way that we feed, like tubing versus bottle versus pail or mom? So just to re-emphasize, colostrum is really more than just immunoglobulins. Colostrum provides a very high fat source, a very high protein source, the immunoglobulins that we focus on a lot. Colostrum is also higher in macro minerals compared to milk and in trace minerals compared to milk. Much higher in vitamins, as we described. But it also contains things like maternal immune cells and growth factors. And we've been recognizing in new research that these things seem to have additional benefits. And this is why now in the dairy industry, we're actually advocating feeding transition milk. Usually we go from our colostrum feeding right to a milk replacer, but now we're starting to think maybe we need to be feeding that transition milk. So I went into the literature to start to answer some of the questions that I posed. And I was really surprised at one, the lack of number of published papers, how recent most of these papers were, indicating there isn't historical information. But then more importantly, the wide variation that we see. So here's a study that looked at Saun goats, and they got a value very similar to what we would expect in dairy cows. But then this study here used two groups of goats, Black Bengal and Saun. But look at how low the concentration was here. Very much lower than this. And we had the same goats, basically. And then this is a study that looked at a wide range of goats, and you can see a wide range again between very low concentration to a higher concentration than dairy. And then another study that looked at alpine, had the average was similar, but then the variation was really great. And then a non-specific milking goat, again, we had what we'd expect in dairy cows, but we also had an extremely high variation. And then another unique indigenous breed here had an extremely low concentration. And so this gives us really no good idea on what is appropriate. And I would, first make the argument, this particular study here and this study here, where they had very, very low values, these were studies that were either done in third world countries like Pakistan and Africa and so on. And so that at least reinforces to me that nutrition is a really key player in colostrum and colostrum quality in our small ruminants, and maybe more so than in our dairy cows. Now, this is that Swiss paper that looked at a wide range of goats. I put in the red line to represent the dairy cow 50 milligram. And you can see we have some goat species breeds that are well below and some are slightly above. But what's interesting here is these breeds right here under this bracket are all dairy breeds, and this is your boar breed, a really true meat goat. And now this is a Nubian and Saun, so that also some dairy breeds, but there was a highly significant difference in the IgG concentration. And so, you know, I think like we have in our cattle breeds, the dairy breeds, because we promote genetically higher milk production, we increase the volume, and this ends up diluting the IgG. Now, similar to what we see in dairy cows, we see a very marked decline in IgG concentration with milking. This is because the production or the transfer of immunoglobulin stops exactly when that fetus spikes the glucocorticoids to signal the beginning of the parturition process. And so as we wait with milkings, what happens is the colostrum gets diluted with regular milk. And so we can see this very rapid decline in the IgG concentration. And what got me started in this whole project was this data that Dr. Mary Smith from Cornell, she contacted me and said, do you have any data on using the Brix refractometer in measuring goat colostrum quality? She recognized that she saw this marked decline in the Brix values over time in goat colostrum. And I said, well, that's something we need to look at. And so how do we measure colostrum? How can we measure colostrum on the farm? On the dairy cattle side, we have this colostrometer that we can use, and this is basically something that measures specific gravity. This has been adjusted to a smaller size to accommodate goats. However, this specific gravity scale is set to 50 milligrams per ml, and that may not be appropriate for goats. And also the temperature, the colostrum has to be room temperature, not chilled or not body temperature. Now, what's been done on the dairy side is we try to make this system without having to collect all this volume of colostrum to put into this colostrometer. We've looked at the possibility of using optical reflection to measure or associate with IgG concentration. And so we have a digital refractometer and optical refractometers that can give us this Brix value. Brix is a measure used originally as a measure of water-soluble carbohydrates in wine and beer and in pastures and so on. But it's an optical reflectance, and it's thought that the protein levels in the colostrum might be correlated with this, and that's what had occurred on the beef side or the dairy cattle side. And this is really an easy way. Here's my technician just putting a drop of colostrum in this digital refractometer. You fill that up, close the lid. You get it started, you use the menu to go to where you want to go. Here we're looking for Brix, and then it takes just a couple seconds, and then you get this value out here. And so this gives us a number, but now we have to interpret that number. Now, we did a couple different studies looking at goat colostrum and sheep colostrum. And you can see here in these studies, the IgG concentration we found was 71 plus or minus 36. So again, high variation. But our mean value was much higher than what was reported in those previous studies. But then you also see that sheep had also a much higher value. You can see the range was similar and even extremely high, and in sheep extremely high. And then we measured Brix, and we did find that there was an association where the Brix value changed relative to the IgG. And so if we plot the Brix value versus the directly measured IgG concentration, we can see for goats, we had a pretty decent relationship here. Not perfect, but we could account for about 73% of the variation. But what's important to notice here is this red line is the cattle relationship. And you can see that the cattle line is very different than the goat line. And so this is an important observation. You can see if I use 50 here and come across, and when I hit the goat line, 50 is associated with about 18 Brix in goats, but for cattle, it's about 22 Brix. So what this is saying is the milk composition, and with goats having a unique fat globule compared to cattle, we need to have different reference ranges for Brix and interpreting the Brix value from goats compared to cattle. We can't use the cattle data, which is what many people are doing. And then we also measured Brix in the fresh sample versus a frozen and thawed sample, and there was no change in that freeze-thaw process. Now, we did measure the IgG in the kids, and you can see we measured the total protein, and we measured the IgG. We got a higher IgG concentration than what we typically expect in calves. In calves, we want to see 10 or above. And so you can see we had a higher value, probably associated with the higher IgG that we fed. But then in this particular group of animals, we knew how much colostrum we fed at what time and what the concentration of the IgG was. And so you can see that overall, we fed approximately 35 grams of IgG, and they got this generally within the 1 hour, 60 minutes. And so we are using this as sort of a baseline. This is not necessarily what would fit the whole population, because some newer work that's come out has suggested that 10 that we used to use for calves is probably too low. And so 10 to basically 18 is considered fair, 18 to 25 is considered good, and above 25 is considered excellent. And so even in our study, we were in that fair range for goats. So we, like I said, we need to define what value here is associated with greater disease protection to come up with, are we going to use the same ranges here for our goats? Now you can see we had 15, but our total protein was in 6. So there seems to be some difference between calves and goats on that side. So what does this mean in terms of practical application? Well, if we are going to try and move to feeding colostrum more appropriately to our kids, my goal, the general recommendation is 10 to 15% of body weight. I actually would like to see it closer to 20. For kids, I use 1 ounce per pound of body weight, and I want to get it in as early as possible. Now, in the study that we did where I showed you that data, we saw no difference in these methods. We used all different methods to feed the goats the colostrum, and we didn't see any difference, but we probably need more numbers to be more robust in that interpretation. And what we're recommending, at least at this point, based on our data, is we'd like to see at least 35 grams of IgG getting into these kids to get us up to hopefully that 15 plus concentration in. Now, as we mentioned, to finish up here, the goat industry, the dairy goat industry, is moved away from using mom's colostrum because of the CAE, and they've gone to using the colostrum replacers that are available commercially. The problem you need to remember is all colostrum replacers are bovine origin. There are no goat colostrum replacers. So that brings up a whole big point of, are the antibodies that are in there even worthwhile in the goats? Is that part of the problem that we're seeing? The other problem we're seeing, this is the guaranteed analysis of a very common replacer product that's out on the market, bovine in origin. You can see the globulin protein, 65 grams per pound. That works out to 4 grams per ounce. All right. And then if you look at how that's supposed to be mixed up and fed, here you feed 1 packet of lamb kid replacer per 4 pounds of body weight. So if we think about 8 pounds, typical weight, 2 packets, that's 8 grams, or that would be 20 or 16 grams of IgG. And that's not even close to the 35 grams that we found in our study. And to show that, this is an older paper, but a study that fed colostrum from the dam at 2 different levels and colostrum replacer at 2 different levels. And I've highlighted the dam at the highest level and the replacer at the highest level. And you can see that obviously the maternal colostrum was far superior in getting IgG concentration into the kids. But you can see this 1500, which would be the 15 milligrams per milliliter that we achieved in our study, was only met at 1 time point at 12 hours. And so this suggests that, you know, maybe this concentration, 3 grams of IgG per kilogram, is even still a little bit on the low side. So to conclude here, the Brix refractometer gives us a tool that we can use to measure IgG or to predict IgG content in goat colostrum, similar to what we do in dairy, and be able to evaluate the quality of the colostrum in the use. The data that I've shown you so far, we're saying is this is a starting point. We're going to advocate that we should be feeding at least 35 grams of IgG in 2 feedings. That's what was done on the farm. And that should get us up to at least 15 milligrams per ml. But whether or not that's adequate enough yet, we still need to determine. Serum total protein of 6 grams per deciliter is associated with this 15 milligrams per ml. So we can actually use total proteins instead of measuring IgG. But we still have a lot more research to do to really get more practical recommendations and understanding of colostrum management in goats. So with that, I again thank you for taking the time to listen to the presentations. I hope the information will be of some use, and you see my email up there. I serve as an extension veterinarian for the state of Pennsylvania, but also answer questions from all around. So if you have any questions after you watch this presentation, feel free to send me an email.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Saun. We appreciate the information. Got a couple questions. The first is recognizing that mama's colostrum in most cases is superior. Help us understand, is there a benefit to heat treating versus pasteurizing, or is that just not the right way to go?
Okay, that's a great question, and we are working on that right now. We have shown in dairy calves that well, first of all, we don't want to pasteurize. Pasteurization is too high a heat, and you're going to denature the immunoglobulin. So pasteurization is out. But in dairy cattle, we've shown, and this is some work that we've done at Penn State, and there's other work that Sandra Godin has done at the University of Minnesota. If we treat at 60 degrees centigrade, treat 60 degrees centigrade for an hour, that heat treated colostrum, we don't degrade the immunoglobulin significantly. It goes down just a tiny bit, but it's enough to kill off the key pathogens, the CAE virus and Ionis. And at least in dairy calves, we found that the absorption efficiency of immunoglobulin is improved. That's something we're working on right now. We have heat treated and non-heat treated colostrum from goats, and we're looking at changes in Brix, and also looking at concentrations in the kids. And we're hoping that we would find the same kind of relationship that we saw in dairy calves. And that would then give us the opportunity to do pot heat treatments. There are some dairy goat farms I'm working with right now that are heat treating their colostrum to deal with the CAE. And you know, we need to validate that so that we can make a more generalized recommendation for other producers.
Very good, very good. One more question. As the transition period where you've got the kids, you know, needing a lot of nutrition, they're large, taking up a lot of space, so the dry matter intake is down. Any benefit or interest in feeding high quality silage during that transition and then starting the production cycle?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways we can get around that. I think the first thing we need to remember, and this is another big long topic, is neutral detergent fiber, our measure of plant cell wall components in our forage, is the controller of intake in our ruminant animals. Ruminant animals can only consume so much NDF. And so there's research going back to the 70s and 80s that came out of Cornell that showed that on average, ruminant animals can usually consume about 1.2% of their body weight as neutral detergent fiber. So like a 1,000-pound animal could consume 12 pounds of NDF. So as we do forage analysis and we look at our NDF values, if you have a grass, hay, or silage that's 60% neutral detergent fiber, they're not going to be able to consume very much of that. And so what I've shown in sheep, and we're working on goats too, is NDF intake in that pregnant animal drops from about 1.2% of their body weight down to around 0.8% of their body weight. So I generally try and recommend a late pregnancy diet that's no more than about 40% neutral detergent fiber in total. So that means if you have a lower quality forage, you're probably gonna have to feed more grain to allow her to be able to eat and get the nutrients she needs, but then we run that risk of acidosis with too high a grain. And so this is really where forage quality becomes such a critical issue.
Very good. We sure appreciate the information, and we are going to move along, take just a little break to transition to our next presenter. Thank you again, and we will talk later.